It's both a very difficult but also a special occasion to be gathering in memory of Hari on his 73rd birthday. What is impossible to believe is that we are organizing a 5th memorial lecture. So this May it will be 5 years, and I don't know where time has gone. But it means a lot to have all of you with us on this occasion, because you've come, I know, both for Hari, but also to hear his very close friend, Arup Banerjee, who somewhere has come out of wilderness to speak again, and we are really delighted that he agreed. Many people ask me, how did you manage to get Arup to agree? I said I didn't have to manage at all. I had gone to meet him last year because I had known that Arup goes nowhere. So I thought, why don't I keep up Hari's tradition, which is Hari would, if somebody didn't step out of the house, Hari would just go there to see them. So today Narayani Erti, who cannot be with us today, remembered how even on a one-day trip to Delhi, which he would do because his mother was unwell, he would fly in the morning, fly back in the night. That's him with his mother. He would make sure to drop by and see her on the way to the airport. And Arup remembered how Hari would drop by. And I remember Rani Di, who was much older than Arup, saying, I am moving around, why can't Shona go out? I said, I don't know. So I decided I would do what Hari did. I thought I would drop by and see him last year. And so I did. And I just very casually said, would you consider doing a memorial lecture for Hari, and online or in person? He said, I'll think about it. And then this November, I was delighted to get an email from him saying, my lecture is ready. So I was really very, very happy. And I said, well, now all I need to do is fix the venue, fix the date. And because Saturday, it says 15 February, happened to be a Saturday, and the hall was free, we are actually meeting on the day itself. So thank you very much, Arup. Thank you also to PK, our close friend, for agreeing today to chair the session and speak briefly about Hari or about the theme. We had a slideshow running through just to there, but what I do want to play for you is a short audio clip of Hari speaking. All of you know that Hari was an excellent teacher. Let me just finish, then we play. So this is him speaking on the centenary year of the Russian Revolution, when he was called often to give lectures. He wrote also. And this is him giving a lecture to a group of college students at Ramakrishna Mission Vidya Mandir, or Belur Math, largely Bengali speaking, which is why Hari begins by saying, there's of course a bit before it, where he says in Bangla that I normally in my class, I mix Bangla and English. I put my notes in English, but I explain in Bangla. Hari was able to move between so many languages. But he said, I don't want to be fully colonized by Bangla. And I understood that. So he said, which is why I can speak, but I somewhere stopped short of learning to write it. My mother tried very hard, though. So he says that normally about 15 to 20 minutes, I manage to do question and answers in Bangla, but I really can't do a 1-hour lecture in Bangla. So he begins by saying, therefore, I will speak in English, but I will take the questions and answers in Bangla. So this is just him. It's on the YouTube channel that Hari has and the website. We put, had Hari lived through the COVID years, we would have had many more recordings because everything we were doing on Zoom were recorded. So Hari left us before that. So we don't have that many lectures by him which are recorded. But a few others we have, and what we do have, we have put up on the website for him.
I will make my presentation primarily in English. The central point of the subject that I've been asked to address is the Russian Revolution, and the way in which the Russian Revolution is to be approached at the beginning of the 21st century. If we were standing about 25 years ago, that is or 30 years ago, in 1987, there would be no question of this order being raised, in the sense that it would be very clear why a discussion of the Russian Revolution was taking place. In those days, there were two major world powers, one a superpower, one for all intents and purposes an aspiring superpower, that were concerned with the Russian Revolution and took as the Russian Revolution the major departure of the 20th century. In many ways, the major departure of the modern world after the French Revolution. Hence, to go back, or at least to celebrate the occasion, was normal. And I wish to underline, it was as much celebrate as to discuss. Hence, the meaning was clear. What was required was to readdress the meaning, to once again find the foundations on which the two states lay, and Cuba obviously was. Cuba, as well as the states of Southeast Asia, were the younger partners in this matter. And also, thereafter, perhaps to raise a few questions, a few memories as you went along. At the beginning of the 21st century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the reorientation of Chinese communist policy in order to handle matters of growth in a way in which the Chinese have sought to do with very little reference to the past, the precise implications and value of the Russian Revolution as a model and as a point of reference are not so clear. In your wall magazine, you have addressed some of these questions, but whatever the case, and we can come back to some of the questions that are raised in the wall magazine later, whatever the case, the point is that we now stand at a time when, in the course of 2017, there will be a few events in India where Russian studies departments and a few history departments, and perhaps colleges like yours, may actually arrange an occasion to think of the centenary. But by and large, the centenary will go unnoticed in this country, and will probably go unnoticed in many countries where once upon a time the Russian Revolution was a point of reference. Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, some of the states of Southeast Asia, such as Cambodia. In all these places, there is a high chance that there will be no ripple, there will be no reference, except amongst a few old stalwarts who used to belong to the communist movement. Once this is said, I think what is important in any history group is at least to find out why the revolution created the ripples that it did. It is very easy simply to say it was a great revolution which created the first socialist state. That socialist state finally withstood one of the most powerful industrial states in the world, i.e. Germany, and its ally Italy during the course of the Second World War, and then constituted itself as a superpower after 1945. Hence, it is worthy of attention, and there can be no doubt that that is true. But that is the history of the Soviet state. It is not the history of the Russian Revolution. Hence, why one should bother with the Russian Revolution rather than the achievement of the Soviet state is one important question here. If you're going to hold a lecture on the Soviet state and its contribution to the 20th century, Yes, perhaps, in fact, you may find a few takers, because many people still live from that particular era and have a sense of why the Soviet state affected the countries that it did. But the October Revolution, why should the October Revolution be worthy of attention? Especially when in the 70 years of the Soviet state, the October Revolution finally came to be ritualized and remembered merely as a starting point rather than a source of instruction and a source for reflection. So I think that is an important question. So let us go back to, as they say, to ground zero, to have a look at precisely what it is about this revolution which attracts attention. What is the event itself?
So that's a clipping that's also up on the website and the YouTube channel. I would like to take this opportunity as Hari's daughter to also extend my thanks to Arup uncle as well as PK uncle. And I'm going to just very briefly introduce both of them and then request the two of them to take the podium. Professor Arup Banerjee studied and taught history at Delhi University for 35 years. He taught courses in Russian, Soviet, and Western European history and is the author of 3 major monographs. His first book, Merchants and Markets in Revolutionary Russia, 1917 to 1930, argued that the Soviet regime exaggerated the threat posed by private enterprise in the construction of a socialist system, and its officials ousted traders from homes and shops by deploying police rather than competing in markets. The second book, titled Writing History in the Soviet Union, Making the Past Work, looks at how historical archives, successive histories of the Communist Party, and journals of the discipline of history and course curricula were prominent instruments in the Bolshevik armature of determining the content of history in the USSR, from the revolution to its demise from the 1980s. And the third book is called Old Roots, North Indian Nomads and Bankers in Afghan, Uzbek, and Russian lands. And it takes the case of Sindhi merchants from Shikarpur as an instance of the substantial scale and volume of subcontinental lending activity within Imperial Russia, where at times the metrics of this turnover exceeded Russian and foreign lending and sale in Moscow and Astrakhan. The session is going to be introduced by Pradeep Kumar Dotto. I know him better as PK Mama. Pradeep Kumar Dotto retired as professor from the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's been working with and teaching in and between Indian history, Indian political thought, and literary cultures of modern times. His various disciplinary interests have overlapped on modern identity formations, initially making a micro-historical examination of Hindu-Muslim antagonisms in Bengal. He subsequently went on to explore literary and political cultures to explore the modern duality of violent and coexisting identities. Currently, he's studying Tagore's World University at Bishwabharati as an early experiment in an alternate global habitation. His publications include a number of co-authored, edited, and written volumes, and these are Carving Blocks, Communal Ideology in 20th Century Bengal, Heterogeneities, Identity Formations in Modern India, and Indian Political Thought. I would request Pradeep Kumar Dotto and Arup Banerjee to take the podium. The topic that Arup uncle is going to be speaking on is the distinctive bounding of the Russian Empire. And PK uncle, yes, and PK uncle is going to be actually talking a bit generally about my father as he introduces the section. I'm just going to read out a short introduction to what Arup uncle will be speaking on. The Russian Empire remained an agrarian and feudal nation state throughout its span of about 400 years. It was nominally inevitable that the need to expand the cereal economy and to encourage the conversion of land in the steppe in the south and the taiga in the east to grain underscored imperial development. The peasants provided an unrelenting propulsive vigor, stabilizing the empire with dependable, because defensible, boundaries brought divergent dynamics into play. Fortified defense lines along the longest southern trim protected the agrarian frontier from nomadic incursions. Diplomacy, to include military engagement along the European western borders, represented the most conventional determinant in empire building. Balancing the budget with revenue from exports of Siberian furs across the Siberian tundra, the so-called dash to the Pacific by 1650, and peasant settlement along the Pacific littoral provided the context for setting the limits of Tsarist and King Chinese power. The Central Asian periphery was endowed with a customs frontier and a political border after the decisive crushing of the Uzbek Khanates there. So, yeah, I will request the two of you to take over.
Ideal warrior in Delhi nowadays.
You want some hot tea?
Yeah, that'll be lovely actually because this water's turned cold. Yeah. So let me first express my gratitude to Mrinalini and Taputi for the privilege of sharing with all of you this occasion of Hari's birthday. So thank you to all of us. And for the privilege of also going to hear Arup, whom I've heard a lot about, and we've been colleagues for a very long time. I've been asked to speak a little bit about Hari, which I will. Let me just say that I knew Hari formally for some time, but it was, I think, my friend Shambhuddha who came back from Cambridge, full of Hari and talking about his warmth, intelligence, and hospitality. So that was my first, intimate but indirect contact with Hari. But my first real personal vivid encounter with Hari was in Calcutta, when we rode together in a crowded private bus, and you know how private buses are in Calcutta, to the house in Salt Lake for dinner. We managed to grab a seat and sat down, relaxed. And then Hari, I think it just started off with some trigger, and Hari treated me to this absolutely unforgettable talk on pre-revolutionary Russian doctors who went to work in rural areas. What struck me was, of course, the obvious element was that of his passion, his precision, which etched this talk in my mind and imagination despite all the crowd and the sweat and the noise and the jolts of that bus. The experience also introduced me to a more important thing, to an essential element of Hari. That is, or that was, is, I keep mixing up the is and was actually. Anyway, his capacity to be embedded in different places and cultures. He belonged to Oxbridge with his precise and clipped accent, as much as to the grime and sweat of Calcutta, while his imagination and scholarship transported me to Imperial Russia. Hari was an embedded cosmopolitan. It's a paradox, but I think it's very true for him. The extraordinarily well-crafted website for Hari, which I suggest you have a look at, is just beautifully done. It says that he lived and grew up at different places in India, Kenya, and England, while achieving fluency in Malayalam, Latin, Russian, French, German. He finally settled in Calcutta from 1978, where he mastered in inverted quotations and scare quotes after what Taputi told us, mastered Bengali, in which he taught many students not comfortable with English. Hari's range is staggering. He wrote media pieces, participated in a documentary, wrote academic articles that spanned agrarian Russia to Indo-Russian relationships and Russia's relationship with Central Asia, down to a synoptic history of the social sciences in India. Meanwhile, he possessed the flexibility, which many of us lack, to work with government agencies and successfully administer research institutes, all the while being a teacher with an extraordinary reputation. And finally, I shouldn't also overlook his role as a coordinator in evolving, I think, historically some of the best textbooks that have been done in India by the NCERT. I mean, this was done by the NCERT, but I think it's one of the best kinds of exercises historically in the history of textbooks in India. From this wide-ranging oeuvre, I will dwell on two things. Both stem from another capacity of Hari, that is, his straddling of both past and present, of academic articles and of media productions. The most striking instance is his involvement with I don't know how it's pronounced, but Afanasy Nikitin, the 15th century Russian trader who traveled from, again, Tver in the northwest of Moscow to the Bahmani and Vijayanagar kingdoms. Research into Nikitin's diary consolidated a larger transition of Hari's academic career, shifting from Russian history proper to its interconnectedness, its interweaving with India's history. Indeed, in many articles, Hari looked at the impact of events in Russia, Soviet Union, on Indian history, and these, I should also add, showed his forays into trying to understand expressive writings and images in this whole kind of research. Hari's work, to return to Nikitin's travelogue, Hari's work shows how Nikitin undergoes the hazardous and grueling journey that is from northwest of Moscow to the south of India, subjecting himself also to the ideas and rituals of different cultures. It was a fraught process in which Nikitin feels he's losing his selfhood. Hari provides a very suggestive insight here when he observes that what gave Nikitin anchorage through his physical and spiritual travails was the very act of writing itself. If writing opens up the complications of the past, the documentary that was produced in 2007, in which Hari was involved very actively, takes us through the many spaces which Nikitin traversed. Hari was part of a team that retraced the more than 6-year stint of Nikitin while traveling, staying in India, going back and so on, in 46 days on jeeps, filming the entire journey. The hour-long documentary can only provide some indications of the many spaces through its images. But read against the article, I haven't read the book, which is there on display, but read against the article, the documentary suggests the many, many worlds that Nikitin traveled, capturing through this the wonder of travel itself, a wonder that may well have spurred Nikitin on his travels. I will end with another, much less direct, straddling of the past and present. One of Hari's early interests in Russian history was the agrarian land relationship in late imperial Russia. A review article on the subject is written with the precise objectivity demanded of a trained scholar who, through the arguments and statistics, nevertheless notes the desperate conditions of the peasantry. Interestingly, a media article published a month before he died in 2020, that's in, I think, April, it was published. He died in, I think, May. Yeah. Revisits the rural world. Revisits the rural world in India, but now in modern India with the rural world, which is also part of the transactions with the urban. In a powerful meditation on hunger during the enforced migration of rural migrants from cities in our country, Hari points to the terrible irony in which a nation that has food stocks that it claims that it can last for 3 years, cannot feed its hungry. It's not just the story of migrant suffering that Hari passionately underlines, but the emergence of a new culture of consumerist inequality. An phenomenon that makes us forget the bare physical need for food in the desire for taste, smells, colors. This culture generates, to cite Hari, quote, a social innocence about genuine starvation and want that limits public capacity to make demands of the state, unquote. And at the same time, for people like us, it prevents realization, quote, that relish for food is empty if it ignores the plight of those unable to savor it, unquote. Souvik Mukhopadhyay, a student and colleague of Hari's, makes an apposite comment. He writes in Bangla, significantly given the kind of history you all know, that quote unquote, sir, always kept developing and revising his ideas. Like Nikitin, Hari traveled and expanded his interests, above all, evolving his ideas, commitments, feelings. Constant journeying is of value, not just to many of us in the evening of our lives, but as Shobik's remembrance tells us, to all those we leave behind. So with this, I just will turn to Arup, who I know for many years as in DU through demonstrations and meetings and so on and so forth, and who academically has an interesting resonance. The trajectory of his development has an interesting resonance with Hari's, in the sense that, I mean, we already have been acquainted with what he's done and what he's and his monographs. But I just want to kind of point out that, like Hari, he stays in one job in Delhi University for 35 years. And again, resonant with Hari, he starts from Russian history proper, that is, the internal workings of the Soviet state in relationship to commercial, in relationship to commercialization, shifts to the preoccupation with history, a more general preoccupation, and this production in the Soviet Union. And thence, interestingly, again resonating with Hari's interest, to Sindhi merchants in Imperial Russia. So his talk today is again, seems to me to be a very, very interesting and challenging one, a very contemporary one also, reflection on the multiple implications of the Russian boundary. So the very idea of boundary itself, I think, is going to be a very, very interesting topic of discussion. Thank you, Arup, and it's over to you.
Thank you, PK. If at any point I can't be heard at the back, then I'd love it if you could let me know. No, it's on. It's on. I consider the invitation from Tapu to deliver this edition of the Hari Vasudevan Memorial Lecture Series an honor and a privilege. It is, of course, a pleasure to be with all of you on this day as we remember Hari intently, affectionately, and affectedly. I first met Hari in 1974 in Cambridge. When Hari and I returned to India in early 1978, Hari shifted to Kolkata. And over the years since, our conversations remained ebullient. They seldom generated heat. They were usually enlightening, definitely for me, probably not for him, and they were much too few. Hari was a person of phenomenal warmth. And Hari was a person of extraordinary charm. But he was a scholar of remarkable stature. I took on this lecture as a very welcome intellectual challenge. It necessarily had to be an intellectual challenge, because only doing the kind of work that I enjoyed doing on it would have justified Hari's reputation. So I relished the process of researching what I'm about to tell you now. And to begin with, it's reasonably certain that the Russian Empire was the largest European empire in the 20th century that remained structurally agricultural, rural, and feudal from its origin in Muscovite Russia, on which a few minutes later I'll explain, in the 1480s, to its end in 1917. It was a richly complicated, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional society, and a point would like to linger through the lecture is that the great diversities of this empire were most striking in the settlement world of the borderlands, where many Russian settlements were established beside non-Russian villages. When I talk about Russians, I talk about the group of people known as the Eastern Slavs. The Eastern Slavs are divided between the great Russians, the Velikie Rossiani of Russia, the Belarusians of Belarus, and the Little Russians of Ukraine or Ukraine. The preeminent contribution of the Russian peasantry in the creation of a unified and geographically bounded empire is nominally inevitable when their numerical dominance is considered. The first and only empire-wide census of 1897 counted 96.9 million peasants out of a total population of 125.6 million. The peasants represented the peasants were 77.1% of the Russian population in 1897. Russia was then divided into European and Asiatic Russias, 50 European provinces, 30 Asiatic provinces, divided unequally by the Ural Mountains. By that time, marketed surpluses of grain to finance the import of capital goods and keep the balance of payments in occasionally brisk health came from peasant farms in greater volume and value than from less productive noble estates. Peasant purchases of consumer goods and payment of land taxes brought in the bulk of indirect taxes, both of which were fiscal mainstays of the time. In 1913, when Russia, 4 years before the revolution, when Russia had become the world's fourth largest manufacturer by value of output rather than by volume of output, small and mainly rural workshops still provided 1/2 of Russia's industrial employment and 1/3 of Russia's industrial output. Peasant artisanal fabrication of goods like garments, utensils, and agricultural implements in workshops known as kustar and remesla sizably met rural consumer demand. One of the running threads this evening for me is that the ubiquity of peasant energy and peasant agency made them the vertebral quintessence of state formation and nation building. Potential colonial spaces were appropriated and possessed by populating their expanses with peasants. My choice of subject for this lecture was influenced by my impression that the peasants were the life force for the empire as migrants and its nemesis as revolutionaries. This view, however, was countercultural then and is counterintuitive now. Most migrant colonists were neither Russians or Orthodox Christians, but were indeed of rural origin. Colonization was accordingly understood by most educated Russians even after 1900, which is a watershed year in the history of the empire, as a peasant question, not an imperial one. The act of peasants moving to the borderlands tended to be known as resettlement, переселение, more often than as colonization, kolonizatsiya. The former a term of relatively benign weight and responsive to rural overpopulation, underemployment, and land hunger. Russian authorities, however, envisioned the creation of an empire in the truest sense, of a collection of formally sovereign polities retaining their political and cultural difference under powerful regional governors appointed by a distant resource extracting Tsar. Geographical contiguity in the territorially single space that Russia happened to be blurred the distinction between metropolis and colony, and this may have been one of the reasons why even liberals didn't see the formation of the empire as an imperial process and preferred to see it as one of peasant resettlement. It's an important factor. Empires do not live by the word, and as we've known from the 20th of January, they don't die by the word either. The vocabulary of elite discourse does, however, influence the content of policy and the manner of its impact on subject, customs, and communities. Statesmen, civil servants, and scholars seemed to be in unison in their belief that Russian colonists at the elite level and as subaltern peasants were imbued with a benevolence in assimilating subject people in their path toward achieving a unitary state by ensuring military security, political centralization, and administrative bonding of the boundary with the core. Imperialism was a semantic distraction in such conversations. In the pre-Petrine Russian Empire, before about 1700, the word civilization, civilizatsiya of feminine gender, was largely synonymous with Christianity. The state took care that churches were built and consecrated right after the establishment of any Russian outpost after the 1450s. The state paid for their construction and provided all the necessary supplies for the conduct of worship. The American Ukrainian historian Michael Khodorkovsky, not to be confused with the Russian person who was imprisoned by Putin, who is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, argue that in an age when politics and religion were still only minimally differentiated, conversion was necessarily inseparable from the goal of winning the loyalty and ability and obedience of colonized people. The newly baptized were incorporated into the life of Russian outposts. Limited numbers of native men were encouraged to convert in order to fill out the slim ranks of Russian guards and garrison regiments on the expanding spatial peripheries of the empire. Furthermore, through baptism, Orthodox Christian baptism, very akin to Roman Catholicism, unmarried men could convert heathen women into manageable brides, which was a scarce resource, in the heavily male-dominated Russian settlements on the frontiers. Although Orthodox Christianity constituted the kernel of Russia's imperial mission, most notably in Siberia, and I'll explain this in a few minutes, it assumed the form of a Christianization in which the importance of conversion qua conversion per se, as a consistent principle and necessary state priority in Russian imperial progress throughout the territory of the realm, remains open to debate. To what extent did submission rather than conversion fulfill the agenda for imperial expansion? It's a question I've raised, and it doesn't really have an answer like any good historical question. Empires are built at the frontier, not just from the center. The regions chosen for consideration in this study felt the imperial presence for different reasons and in diverse ways. Muscovite expansion southward into the Ukrainian steppe after about 1500 was indispensable in providing the first Russian state with fertile land for peasantry settlement and a grain basis of military expansion. The inhabitants of the steppe were neither Russian, nor Christian, nor sedentary. They were other people, inarodnie люди, by nomenclature. Yet the annexation of their ancestral land was not acknowledged as an imperial exertion, even by Lenin. The propulsive vigor for the swift passage across Siberian came from purely extractive greed for furs and later for arable land for grain cultivation after the 1880s, when the land for man, I'm sorry to be slightly sexist, but that is a term used in classical economics, ratio in the southern producive provinces turned perilously negative and necessitated the opening of new land across the Ural Mountains, which separated Asiatic Russia from European Russia. The most insistent impress of Orthodox Christian proselytization was experienced by the non-Christian Siberian people. They were to be regarded as Russian only when they embraced the Orthodox faith. Russian control in the Caucasus going into the south, the whole thing was called Zakavkaz, which literally meant going south of the rock. That's what it translates as, Zakavkaz, was accomplished with a political economy that was radically different from that prevalent in the heartland. It was based upon Cossacks, state peasants, not serfs, state peasants, and native people like the Buryats and the Kalmyki. By the 1780s, the Empress Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, felt that the need to check Turkish power in the northern Black Sea coastline was unavoidable, but more importantly, it was undelayable. The annexation of the Caucasus and the Trans-Caucasus ensued even as Novorossiya came into being there. This is the term that had fallen out of use until Vladimirovich Putin brought it back into use on the 21st of July of 2021 in a notoriously ghastly speech. Russia became a Black Sea power. In addition, expansion into the steppe added the largest area of new steppe land since the 16th century. Finally, the Uzbek Khanates in Central Asia straddled the non-demarcated frontier between British India and Tsarist Russia, proximate to the Oxus River, the Amudarya, and the Pamir Mountains. The attainment of a dependable because defensible frontier in this most southern imperial rim was not a matter merely of military strength, or military triumph, but rather one of full-blown colonial transformation. The Mongol conquest of Russia in the late 13th century, beginning with the 1240s, mid-13th century, was a watershed of inestimable consequence in Russian history. This forced the recognition on Russian rulers that only a strong state with a centralized government capable and willing to invest significant resources to the defense of the steppe frontier could avert similar disasters. Peasants were at the core of both arms of the imperial practice that defined the nation and the state. They were the cultivators who were aggregating territory from which grain could be procured. And as serfs, or in certain areas, freed peasants, they were perennially liable to be called up for 25 years. So when a peasant who was called up left the village, the ceremonies of departure resembled that of a funeral. Muscovite Russia was a vast territory. I'm going to now outline some of the ways in which an edifice of knowledge was built concurrent with the usurpation of sovereignties and the incorporation of territories. Muscovite Russia was a vast territory that stretched across Eurasia to the Pacific by the 1650s. In that expanse, locating people, identifying them, assumed immense urgency because both the state and its unruly subjects, that's not my word, were in constant motion across the continent. Maps were prepared that served the strategic interests of the regime. On these maps, political borders, military supply routes, fortifications, the routes followed by nomadic peoples and military supply lines feature prominently and clearly to this day. The reign of Tsar Ivan from 1462 to 1505, known rather unfairly as Ivan the Terrible or Ivan Grozny, witnessed the dramatic growth of the Muscovite Grand Principality, both in terms of territory and administration. It saw the growth of the first bureaucracy in Russia. It saw the growth or the beginnings of a term used very often these days, the green shoots, of a political and religious ideology to legitimize the power of this ruler. His grandson Ivan IV, who ruled from 1533 to 1584, transformed Muscovy into a multi-ethnic empire composed of a variety of formerly sovereign polities. He dispatched his staff to carry out extremely detailed cadastral surveys known as the Pistovia Knigi of the extent, location, population, and ownership of land throughout the realm. These surveys served as the basis for taxation and military service obligations. Tsar Peter, who ruled from the 1680s to 1725, founded the very first professional school in Europe dedicated to training full-time cartographers in the 1690s. By the time of Catherine the Great, scientific survey mapping had become an integral part of Russian practice. By 1800, Russia had acquired her boundaries of 1917. Only Central Asia remained to be acquired and was acquired after 1850. In the history of Russian expansion, the aforementioned Michael Khodorkovsky describes how the empire was silhouetted by knowledge to shape its construction. The government depended on individuals who possessed intimate knowledge of both Russia and their own society, and who were thereby able to serve as intermediaries to record and explain social life in the peripheries. In the Muscovite Empire, they were usually employed as interpreters. Most were former Slavic prisoners of war who claimed to have learned the native language and mores during their captivity. In fact, almost all of them were illiterate, and they knew little of the language and culture in which they claimed expertise. Muscovy's government chancelleries compiled territorial descriptions and maps, even as some observers of the time were beginning to show an interest not only in the numbers, whereabouts, and political inclinations of the nomads, but also in their faith and customs, the birth of Russian ethnography. Tsar Peter's academic cultural elite, most of whom were German or Ukrainian, collected information of every sort on the country. Peter is one of Putin's three heroes. As Russian involvement with the non-Russian peoples deepened, authorities relied on locals who had become exposed to the Russian way of life. Russia began to train its own experts in indigenous languages and in their societies and religions from the mid-19th century. But throughout the imperial era, which is roughly from the 1480s to 1917, most of Russian cultural interlocutors came from the indigenous societies. This is a point I would like to emphasize. Throughout the imperial era, most of Russia's cultural interlocutors came from the indigenous societies. From the 1780s, Russian authorities began to demand that the native elites send their sons to the imperial capital which after 1703 was St. Petersburg, to be educated at the empire's court or in Russia's military schools. Very few went. The porous frontiers of Muscovite Russia witnessed an inexorable expansion by peasant migration and settlement to Siberia and the Ukrainian steppe. They were from central Russian or northern central or central Volga provinces, hoping to escape from high rent payments, bad harvests, and or poor land allotments in terms of soil quality. The state pursued a deliberate policy of organizing peasant settlement by encouraging them to inhabit the territories along the southern and eastern frontiers. This is why the peasants were so important. First, the state sent militarized settlers to serve on the fortified lines, and in the garrison towns it built to defend its frontiers from nomadic raids. Once areas behind the frontiers were militarily secure, the state granted lands to noble landowners known as the pomeshchiki, or permitted them to buy land rather than hold it as a service, as a holding on the condition of service to the emperor, to populate their new estates by moving peasants from the central regions. In this way, noble land ownership and serfdom spread from the forest heartland of the first Russian state in the junction of the Oka and Muscovy rivers, Moscow, southwards to the central Black Earth and the mid-Volga regions, which is essentially the Ukraine. The settlement of Siberia was made by the state policy of promoting peasant migration from the 1880s. Settling Siberia was one of the questions for building the Trans-Siberian Railway. By 1900, the Great Siberian Migration, GSM in capital letters, had become massive enough to turn this Russia beyond the Urals, quote, Russia beyond the Urals, into the empire's leading zone for new agricultural settlement. After 1881, the state offered subsidized fares to peasant migrants, icons, religious paintings, loans, tax exemptions, subsidies, the measurement of future farms, the payment of all health expenditures for 10 years, and the testing of soil. On occasions when the state was unable to attract sufficient settlers, it used compulsion to move people to the borderlands. The most extensive use of compulsion was the policy of exiling political critics, criminals, vagrants. Vagrants essentially meant people who were not productively employed, and other undesirables to Siberia. The word itself, Siberia, acquired sinister connotations of penal servitude, savage cruelty known as Sibirny, which is an adjective, and a harsh life, Sibirshchina, which is a proper noun. The dramatic increase in the peasant population from under 9 million in 1678 to over 50 million in 1897 put growing pressure on the land available for cultivation in the traditional areas of peasant settlement. And so this was an important factor for migration from the forest heartland of central and northern Russia that lay to the north of Moscow to the steppes where the soils were more fertile and the climate less severe, and east over the Ural Mountains into Siberia. Migrating to Siberia was easier than going to the expense of renting additional land or changing to more complicated and demanding intensive farming techniques. Most of Russian agriculture, cereal agriculture, was extraordinarily unproductive because it was extensive. You don't cultivate a given plot of land better, you just cultivate more land. At this time, most peasant migrants to Siberia came not from the infertile northern regions, but from the fertile and densely settled provinces of the central Black Earth and Volga regions of Russia, and from the equally fertile but much more densely populated Ukraine. Peasant views concerning their migration and resettlement are ensconced in laconic and often mediated sources. Historians have retrieved these from peasant proverbs, resettlement petitions, usually asking not to be moved, village histories recorded by priests and ethnographers, itinerant or temporary movement to visit neighbors, to attend church, to trade at fairs was integral to peasant life and usually experienced without anxiety. Permanent resettlement was an entirely different rupture. Relocating over long distances meant leaving relatives, ancestral graves, an entire world of the familiar, all for the hazards of turning one's fate over to new places, new neighbors, and new officials. Just a very brief word on serfdom. I'm not going to take too much time defining it, but I think a brief description is necessary. The landed estate, known as the pomestye, was the institution responsible for converting imperial ambition into military reach. Land was held in return for service by pomeshchiki, or the service gentry. Only service gave the right to hold land, and this phenomenon afforded the means whereby an chronically, perennially impoverished state found itself able to defend and expand its remote and vulnerable frontiers. The service gentry became the nucleus for a permanent army, as well as providing staff for a central administration. The estates of the nobility, with their seigneurial serfs, moved south and east along the steppe and taiga frontiers. The landowning gentry were freed from compulsory service by Tsarina Catherine. The defense, expansion, and colonization of the realm were the main uses to which resources extracted from peasants were invested. It was easier to collect indirect taxes on consumer goods and undertake the conscription of peasants into the military if the peasants stayed in one place, which is the essential raison d'etre of serfdom. The enslavement of Russians by Russians was a mechanism of internal colonization. It is a regime of population management, and it was an instrument of production. But even as serfdom locked all Russians into fixed locations, however, imperial expansion destabilized notions of fixity, undermining central efforts at freezing the population in space by encouraging soldiers and settlers to personify conquest and colonization in regions remote from their original homes. Constantly requiring more peasants and soldiers to feed and man its frontier outposts, the regime had to undermine its own commitment to the stable immobility of serfdom and encourage resettlement along the imperial frontiers. This was only one of the puzzling aspects of serfdom. There is another one to which I'll draw your attention now. Centrally located peasants suffered more from serfdom than anyone else. The closer a particular province was to Moscow, the higher was the percentage of serfs there. There were very few privately owned serfs in northern Russia. There were none in Russia, in Siberia. However one defines the core of this empire, the closer one got to it, the more serfs there were. They were pulled toward the borderland by the possibility of greater freedom, more and better land, and better conditions of life and labor available to migrant settlers, accompanied by these subsidies and forms of assistance that the state proffered. In the long history of serfdom, from 1649 to 1861, the peasants of the internal provinces were enslaved earlier and emancipated later than the peasants of the imperial periphery. And this is not a question of news reaching the imperial periphery late, given the forms of communication at that time in history. It was just deliberate strategy. Was the practice of making peasants into serfs consistent with the idea that Orthodox Christian Russians were fit to be serfs and others were not? Another question to which I do not have an answer. Geography placed Russia on Europe's periphery. Russian expansion in the European, western, and northwestern borderlands partly grew out of a fear for the security of the empire's political and economic heartland. This was particularly true as regards the annexation of Finland in 1808 to 9. The border of Finland at that time a Swedish province until 1918, ran dangerously close to St. Petersburg, the capital, after 1703. It therefore made sense to annex Finland and push back the frontier. In addition, the western borderlands of Imperial Russia were much richer, they were more populous than Russian Asia, east of the Urals, and usually made a far greater contribution to the state's treasury and its military power by offering soldiers who were not conscripted and whose conditions of service were almost liberal compared to those who came from the Russian Empire. Russia's western borders, initially with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a huge imperial speciality, were clearly demarcated, negotiated with the state-organized neighbors of Moscow, and agreed upon in written treaties with Warsaw, which is the capital of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Joined dynastically with Poland from 1387, the Grand Duchy, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, controlled modern Belarusian and Ukrainian lands that stood between Moscow and the Baltic and shared the steppe frontier with the Habsburg Empire. Thereafter, the Treaty of Turkmenchay with Persia in 1828 advanced the periphery of the Russian Empire to the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan today. It is not a sea anymore, it's completely dry. And the Treaty of Adrianople with the Ottomans in 1829 consolidated Russian rule in Georgia and Bessarabia, which is now part of Romania. The acquisition of the Black Sea littoral between 1774 and 1792, the second and third partitions of the Polish Empire between Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary in 1793 and 1795, an act of political butchery, and the annexation of Georgia, Finland, and the Duchy of Warsaw between 1801 and 1815, enlarged the empire so that it attained its maximal extent in the western and southern theaters. And only minor changes would be brought about by the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Crimean War that Russia had started, and the Congress of Berlin, where Russia went to fight in defense of the Serbs in Yugoslavia, or the land of the southern Slavs. Russia's western territory was a border because the western neighbors were sovereign states. Russia's southern zone of separation was a frontier, a region demarcating the margin of a settled territory. And this remained ambiguous and evanescent. Demarking a conventional border in the Eurasian steppe was precluded by the absence of a notion of territorial sovereignty among the nomads. In Siberia, officially, the frontier separated those local peoples who paid tribute, known as yasak, to the government from those who did not. Classified as hostile, near Mirny and Yudi, in other words, people who were not at peace with Russia and resident across the frontier. Their lands witnessed military incursion with forts built and tribute extracted. By the late 18th century, Russia's expanding frontiers reached those of the Ottoman and Persian empires in the south and Qing China in the southeast. Imperial frontiers were becoming imperial borders. As I said, there were no clearly delineated boundaries on Russia's south. So how was there a separation at all, you might well ask? In three ways. The line of separation was, first of all, a confessional one between Christianity and Islam. Secondly, it was an economic one between a sedentary population occupied with agricultural production and a nomadic population based on pastoral herding. And third, it was a political one between a sovereign state under one monarch after 1480, on the one hand, and tribal confederations lacking undivided sovereignty, but allied by ties of kinship and mutual defense responsibility. So Muscovite colonization between the 14th and 17th centuries encountered steppe societies not organized into states and therefore with no notion of territorial sovereignty. The frontier was neither marked nor negotiated nor agreed with the nomads, who were structured as tribal groups bound by ties of kinship and military alliance. Steppe societies defined submission very differently to the way that Moscow did. While Moscow required an oath of allegiance known as Syert, the surrender of hostages from important families known as amanat, and the payment of a tax known as yasak, the nomads regarded oaths as non-binding, and the payment as non-binding, resented the demands for hostages, and interpreted the gifts from the Russians as part of an exchange for furs or any other medium for yasak, rather than an exaction denoting submission. Confrontation was unavoidable because the interests of the two generic formations were irreconcilable by diplomacy, which is not the case with Russia's western and northwestern borders. In one respect, the ascendancy of Moscow over rival claimants to a dominant post-Mongol sovereignty had been fostered by the Mongol policy of seeking a single Russian prince to mobilize a loyal military force and deliver tribute to the Mongol authorities. Similarly, in their dealings on the southern boundary with nomad formations, Moscow sought to identify a single ruler capable of being a reliable ally and curbing raids, containing the taking of captives and furthering trade. One of the things that Hari and I used to talk about is one of the princes that the Mongols wanted to identify was the Prince of Tver, and Hari worked on Tver, local government in Tver in the 19th century. An example of one of our conversations. Muscovite policy on the southern frontier was inflected with a religious edge. As Orthodox Christians, Moscow's rulers were driven by a divine duty to save their Christian subjects from captivity by infidels. Funds for rescuing Christian captives were to be, and for certain periods, were raised by the proceeds from a ransom tax that lasted from 1551 to 1679. The protracted loss of the Russian population to slavery had virtually stopped by the 1720s. Peasant settlers, whose main concerns were their families and their farms, were no match militarily for the mobile nomadic horsemen who had dominated the steppes before and even after the peasants arrived for a while. The settlers needed the military might of the Russian state to defeat, displace, and kill the nomads. It was the state which organized the fortified lines, frontier, defensive lines, and the towns, and which conscripted the men to defend them. The bounding of a nascent empire along its southern frontier by stretches of ramparts and palisades from the time of Kievan Russia, which lasts from around 860 to 1220, was meant to prevent nomad incursions as well as the conversion of recent arable back to pasture. Essentially, the fault line between what was known as Rus lands, the lands of the Eastern Slavic Russians, the Great Russians, the White Russians, and the Little Russians, from what was known from the steppe, which was then known as the Dikie Polye, the wild field. Dikie means wild because of the activities of Cossacks who could not be contained. From the state's point of view, the additional tax revenues generated by the peasant settlers and the larger tax-paying population, which could be supported by expanding its frontiers, made the conquest, defense, and the settlement of the steppes a worthwhile and feasible proposition. There was no Russian state until 1480, but only separate Russian principalities, each of whose princes ruled only by virtue of securing a yardlik, a document of submission, or a patent, as is sometimes been translated, from the nearest Mongol Khan. The renunciation of the Mongol yoke, as it is very quaintly known, that's the phrase used, occurred that year. The Mongols were content to allow considerable local autonomy to their Russian vassals for as long as submission, tribute, and conscripts were obtained. The Russians waged their first serious battle against the Mongols in 1380, and they lost. During the century to 1480, Mongol fratricidal struggles, rather than Russian battlefield victories, led to the formal end of Mongol rule. Mongol fratricidal struggles, not Russian military victories. The Golden Horde of 1240 descended from Genghis Khan, split into three khanates, of Crimea in 1430, of Kazan in 1436, and of Astrakhan in 1466. By the time Chinggis Khan, born in 1160 and died in 1227, by the time he died, his empire occupied the expanse between the Pacific Ocean and the Caspian Sea. The limits of Mongol territory were largely dictated by the land, and in particular the availability of pasture. This army was almost entirely made up of cavalry and commanded half the horses in the world at its zenith. After the Mongols completed their conquest of North China in 1234, their great Khan, Chinggiz's grandson, one of Chinggiz's grandsons, Agadei, convened a Kurultai, a meeting of the empire's elite members that approved plans to advance westwards with an invasion of Europe. The Mongol arrived on the Volga-Bulgarian frontier in early 1236, were defeated there, turned back, and set about subjugating all the steppe nomads in their rear east of where they had come from. The Russian campaign was well planned and carried out in 2 phases over 3 years. It began with a swift conquest of the Middle Volga in 1237-38 and concluded with the capture of Kiev in 1240, which incidentally brought to an end the first organized state in Europe from about 860 or 870 to 1240. The first organized state in Europe where Weber's definition of a monopoly on the exercise of legitimate force applied, which had a bureaucracy and which had a tax collecting apparatus. This was Kievan Rus. In their accounts of the Mongol invasion, the Russian chronicles invariably emphasized how heavily the Russians were outnumbered by their Asiatic conquerors. It was the only way they were prepared to explain their defeat. But the Mongol victory had less to do with numbers. The Kievan princes had twice as many warriors at their disposal than the Mongols did. It had to do much more with the sovereignty, with the superiority of the Mongol cavalry. Mongol domination over the Russian principalities shifted the political center of Russian life from the steppe to the forest region, in other words, going north of Kievan Rus, to come south again after 1480. It went north first and then came south, facilitating the rise of Muscovy, the polity that emerged during the 14th century in the northeastern realm of the former Kievan Russia. Kievan Russia was the parent, and Muscovy was the descendant. And this was not noted by Putin in July of 2021. Again, although formal independence from Mongol vassalage was achieved in the reign of Vasily II, it was only under the rule of his son Ivan III that Moscow established control of the entire territory that had formerly been Mongol Russia by simply ceasing to pay tribute and by simply ceasing to send a representative to the Mongol court. This laid the foundations of Muscovite sovereignty over the entirety of Mongol Russia, which elided into the Romanov dynasty from 1630, which elided into provisional governments from February of 1917 and to Bolshevik governments from October of 1917, in a nutshell. He annexed the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 and that of Astrakhan in 1556. This brought the Muscovite frontier to the Caspian with navigational control over the entire Volga River. Now, after the land of the steppes had been seized from their nomadic pastoralists living there and secured for Russian peasant settlement by Ivan IV in the 1550s, the state joined and constantly manipulated the shifting alliances and rivalries between the steppe peoples, periodically allying with the Kalmyks against the Bashkirs, the Kazakhs against the Cossacks, and I think you get the idea. The indigenous elites were co-opted by the grant of noble status in return for oaths of allegiance, of tribute, and of service. So growing numbers of agricultural settlers moved from regions with significant areas of forest in the north, with adequate supplies of water, but in many cases, soil that was moderately fertile and losing its topsoil because of overcultivation and slash and burn methods of cultivation. They settled in the steppe region, which is the steppe are the grasslands that extend from the Hungarian Pushta all the way across Eurasia to the Pacific Ocean. That is what the steppe is. And most of the steppe then and now is in Ukraine. By the they settled in the steppe region, which was predominantly grassland with a semi-arid climate, periodic droughts, but extremely fertile soil. In time, growing grain in the fertile soil dominated the steppe economy. But before the steppe could become the black soil, because of its highly fertile black earth known as the chernozem, because of the humus in the soil, or known as the breadbasket of Europe, it had to be culturally reimagined as a place of opportunity for the Russian state rather than as a threat to its existence. Only the defeat and the decimation of the nomads in the late 18th century finally transformed the steppe into virgin lands, and this reminds me of the vocabulary of Zionists, suitable for settlement and hospitable for agriculture. Moscow began building the Zasyeka, a series of fortifications, long lines moving progressively southwards of fortifications, to prevent nomadic raids against Muscovite towns and villages. The history of the Russian Empire is occasionally considered to have begun in the 1550s. In that decade, Tsar Ivan IV conquered and annexed the Tatar, which is another word for the Mongols, Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan on the river Volga. These victories began the process of Russian annexation, formal Russian imperial annexation of the steppe, not colonization. The fertile lands beyond the Oka River were thus open to peasant colonization and the spread of settled agriculture in place of erstwhile nomadic pastoralism. Unlike the tribes whom Moscow had conquered in the previous 2 centuries, the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan were developed states. They were the first such states to be annexed by Moscow, and the first Muslim peoples to come under its rule. Their annexation, and in fact the first Muslim people to be conquered by white people since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The annexation opened the way to further imperial expansion into Siberia, across the steppe, and to the Caucasus in the south. With the Muscovite conquest of the city of Kazan, the capital of a Mongol Khanate, one of the 3 Mongol Khanates, the other one was Astrakhan, the third one was Kazan Astrakhan in the Crimea. In 1552, the first Orthodox Christian victory against a Muslim state had occurred, barring Constantinople. The victory over Kazan has traditionally been presented as a religious triumph and only secondly, as a military one. Moscow extended its control over the Volga trade route, which immediately offered new tariff revenue and improved security against nomadic raiders. Kazan had been an established agricultural region since the 12th century, 2 centuries before the formation of Muscovite Rus, and about the same time as the end of Kievan Rus. At that time, military success created formidable challenges for both Tsar and Church. No precedent existed for assimilating a non-Slavic, non-Orthodox entity into the Russian polity. When the Khanate of Astrakhan fell in 1556, it was evident that Muscovy had gained direct access to the Caspian Sea, and it brought the Tsar into direct conflict over boundaries with both the Turkish, Ottoman, and the Persian Safavid empires. The construction of key fortresses, of new fortresses at key locations throughout the region, which reinforced the Muscovite military presence in the region and garrisoned its main artery of trade, which was the Volga River, and remained so even after the building of railways from the 1870s onwards, was the first sign of Muscovite imperial strategic vision. The ethnographic knowledge acquisition had preceded this by about 200 years. Then came the planning and construction of a defensive line of small settlements known as the stanitsi, and guard towers that comprised the first military defensive line in Muscovite history from 1571. By 1578, the final portion of the new Arzamas line had been constructed, extending from Arzamas, which is south from Nizhny Novgorod, where some of Hari's best pictures came during the Afanasy Nikitin trip, up to Tetyushi on the Volga River, south of Kazan. the gradual fracturing of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century left an abandoned area. It was literally an abandoned area. The wild field of Dikoya Polye, which we heard about 10-15 minutes ago, beyond the Dnieper River to the south. The Dnieper River is the one that latitudinally, not equally bisects Ukraine. Before the 17th century, the word travelers used was not steppe, but Polye, which means field. Tatars, who were the former Turkic allies of the Mongols, who no longer accepted the suzerainty of the Mongol Khan and were therefore called Kazakh, from which about Cossacks come, or free men, banded together in groups to make a living by raising cattle and assaulting peasant settlements. Captives were sold as slaves on the markets of the former Greek and Genoese cities dotting the northern Black Sea littoral, Novorossiya. But by then, Ottoman cities of the Black Sea shore. They were Ottoman cities, so the Ottomans were buying Russian slaves, which is a very important reason for their wars later in the century, the rescue of slaves. The first written description of the steppes was provided in the mid-5th century before the Common Era by Herodotus. He described a region between the rivers Istyr, or the Danube, and the Tanais, or the Don, to the north of the Black Sea, on the frontiers of the world known to the ancient Greeks, which he called Scythia, which you're all familiar with from school. There are few descriptions of the steppes by travelers from Russia prior to the 18th century. There were no reason for them to go there. It was too unsafe. The first recorded use of the word steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E, spelled that way in any language, was in around 1600 by William Shakespeare. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, in Act 2, Scene 1, Titania utters the phrase, quote, "the furthest steppes of India." I don't know why he meant India. The Russian botanist Leonid Chornyaev identified the distinguishing characteristics of the steppe in 1865 as the absence of forests, the scarcity of running water, the aridity of the climate, the summer heat waves, the mosquitoes, the winter cold, and the flatness of the landscape. Writers on the Russian Empire regularly contrasted the steppes, writers and painters in the Russian Empire, I should say, regularly contrasted the steppes with the forested world, the abundance of conifer forests, and water in northern and central Russia, with a shortage of both in the steppe region. This is where the wheel first came into its own. Thousands of wheeled wagons have been found in steppe graves, dating to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Central Muscovite power came to rely on a group of people known as the Cossacks on the Dnieper and Don rivers, the Black Sea, and the northern Caucasus. Who were these guys? Very difficult to define them. They defined themselves by the concept of volia, or freedom. Freedom from rule, freedom from intermediation, freedom from paying taxes, freedom from religion, freedom from submission. They were intermediaries providing armed escorts for Muscovite diplomats and merchants, fending off nomadic attack, protecting Russian settlers, and fortifying the border against runaways fleeing the empire, runaway Serbs fleeing the empire. Conversely, Cossacks provided the catalyst, the organizational ability, the strategic vision for some of the most challenging rebellions for Moscow that erupted from the rimlands of the empire and that unified disparate social groups aggrieved by a serfdom or taxation, namely led by Ivan Balatnikov in 1606 to 1607, Stepan Razin, 1670 to 1671, Kondraty Bulavin, 1707 to 17, and most famously by Emelian Pugachev, who was killed most brutally by impalement across a wheel. Now, so the Cossacks played a dual sort of role. There was a new defense frontier which was coming up at the same time, built of these with these fortified lines, and the most important one of them is one that has been in the news a lot here in the last 6 months. It's Belgorod. Belgorod is from where the Ukrainians have been attacking Russia from Kursk. before August actually of last year. The towns on the line were regarded as Ukrainie Garodi, which means frontier. The very word Ukrainie comes from Russian word Ukraini, which means on the rim or frontier. That delimited the zone of transition between the steppe and Russia. It still does. The Belgorod line became a stopping point for Russian settlement, for serfdom, and the expansion of the Muscovite administrative system. This imperial boundary in 1671 acquired all the trappings of modern international boundaries. The officials issued travel documents in bound paper books. They had checkpoints. They ran patrols. They levied custom duties. They carried out inspection of luggage. All Russians seeking to travel beyond the Belgorod line were ordered to obtain travel documents stating the purpose of the trip, the destination, the time frame in which they would return. Today, if Russians travel beyond Belgorod, they're in Ukraine. It took the government another century to extend the fortification further east from Tambov to Simbirsk on the Volga. Beyond it were Cossacks, nomads, and an elitist and an elusive vision of Volia that embodied the dreams of the disaffected and the disaffections of the powerful. Beyond the Belgorod line, the government ceded settlement initiative to two groups of people, to the Ukrainians, who were then known as the Cherkasy, and to the Don Cossacks, who were known as the Donske Kazaki. When the Tsaritsyn line was completed in 1718, and this is the Russian border until the conquest of the Caucasus. In 1718, it stretched from the Volga to the Don River. The Caucasus Range was Russia's obvious southern natural frontier. Frontier, not border, frontier. It divided the world of the steppe from the quite different peoples and lands to their south. Tsarist Russia Russia moved to the conquest of the Caucasus in 1783 when Catherine the Great conquered Crimea in that year. Because to do so before that, it was impossible before that because it required bases on the Black Sea, military bases on the Black Sea. It required secure river communications along the Volga from the Black Sea up north to St. Petersburg, actually, because that was the capital by then, and a settled agricultural population in the northern Black Sea coast from which to draw supplies. Now, Russia turned, the annexation of the North Caucasus had to be put off for all these reasons. But in the wake of Napoleon's victory, or in the wake of Russia's military victory over Napoleon in 1812, the decision, and here again the word occurs in Russian sources, it's not my verb of choice. The decision to pacify the North Caucasus was taken. Several appetites fed this ambition. Preventing brigandage. It's quite a common term of use at that time. Along the frontier, seizing the land that could be used for farming and commerce, bringing the natives into submission, and securing Russia's expanding control of Transcaucasia, the Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani lands. And the task of pacifying the North Caucasus fell to the commander of the Russian troops in the Caucasus from 1816, General A.P. Yermolov. You might be interested to know that one of the people that came into common conversation in Russia in June and July when the rebellion was put down was General Yermolov, because he was one of the most brutal Russian commanders and he was operating in the Caucasus. He's justly earned a title of extraordinary brutality. Yermolov's tenure was marked by virtually non-stop military campaigns and the destruction of native settlements by burning them down. The Caucasus War, a staggered and staggeringly poignant ghazawat, a war with religious undertones, against the Russians would continue until 1859, and then after 1994, first by Boris Yeltsin and then by Vladimir Putin in 1991. For its part, the Russian government undertook a systematic colonization of the region by stationing troops in the numerous forts, dispatching bureaucrats, merchants, and priests to the newly built towns, and encouraging the newcomers to settle and farm the land. The settlement of Russian peasants in the Caucasus lowlands, the transfer of Christian peoples to change the ratio between Muslims and Christians, the transfer of Cossack forts, and the practice of cutting down forests in order to make the landscape more suited to its troops and artillery helped to secure Romanov control of the Caucasus during the Caucasus War, which ran from 1817 to 1864. By the mid-19th century, almost 300 years after Russia's first attempt to conquer and colonize the region, the North Caucasus appeared substantially, ineradicably, irremediably altered by the impact of Russian policies. Why? One of the reasons for why the annexation of Black Sea coast south of the Caucasus was fraught with disaster was because it was a terrain that could not be mastered in short time, either by the plow or by Russian immune systems to pathogens. The attrition rate was enormous as settlers and soldiers died in large numbers from the plague, from malaria, from typhus, from scurvy, from cholera. Curiously, the spar industry in the North Caucasus got its start because of the high rate of sickness in the region. And these spars in the North Caucasus were often places where Gorbachev used to take important visitors when he was ruling in Stavropol, which may or may not have helped him become the first secretary from 1985 onwards. Anyway, most of the changes occurred in the first half of the 19th century. Rivers were diverted, primeval forests systematically cut down, pasture land seized to build forts, settlements, industries, and spars. The traditional economies became more dependent on Russian products and cash. The slave trade was formally abandoned, even though it was not uncommon for many native children and women to be sold to Russian officials and end up in brigandage across the frontier in Russia proper. The action that changed the region most brutally and significantly was the expulsion of hundreds and thousands of the region's native inhabitants that historians of the Caucasus, including Michael Khodorkovsky, have called ethnic cleansing, most of whom left for the Ottoman Empire, a journey that many did not survive, so that the Black Sea itself became a mass grave. Siberia is most widely associated in the lay mind and the specialist mind as the empire's carceral, whether Russian or Soviet. Russians were first exiled to Siberia in 1590, at about the same time that the earliest fur trappers, private individuals called the Pramishleniki, arrived there. Siberia's seemingly infinite expanses absolved the state from having to build a network of prisons to accommodate its growing convict population. Even landowners and village communes obtained exilic authority in the 1760s, and they enthusiastically embraced it as a way of getting rid of unproductive peasants and other undesirables. It was not until the 1880s, however, that Fyodor Dostoevsky and others produced an exilic literature. This was not a literary archive composed by the victims, because most exiles at that time lacked a bent for the memoir. Tsarist exile blighted many more generations than Soviet exile, and its worst features inspired and were perfected by Stalin's Gulag, the Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagereje, Chief Inspectorate for the Corrective Labor Camps. It sounds like a mild euphemism. It's an archipelago of labor and death camps, as described most exhaustively by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Siberia's small but unruly population of Cossacks, indigenes, trappers, state peasants, fugitives, and criminals led Moscow and later Petersburg to believe that only a military government could keep it in check. Siberian exile had a primarily economic rather than a punitive function at that time, the early years. Exile served the Russian state as a source for civilian and military service, for settlement, and the strengthening of boundaries, as well as the production of food supplies to maintain service people. In sum, all the objectives that underlay coercive labor of Russians in the bounding of the empire that we've been talking about for a few minutes now. When the Russians arrived in Siberia in the late 16th century, 230,000 indigenes were there, speaking 120 distinct languages. This was the polyphonic periphery of a multi-ethnic empire. The population declined by 15% over the next century because the disease and the alcohol introduced by Europeans, but began to rise steadily after 1700 because of the development of immune systems in the bodies of the indigenes. Profits from the Siberian fur trade had been the original reason for Russian expansion into Siberia in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Russians arrived in small numbers that did not hunt the fur-bearing animals themselves. They did not hunt the fur-bearing animals themselves. They exacted tribute simply by taking over the tributary system once managed by the Mongol Golden Horde, whom they displaced in the 1640s. But the amounts they demanded exceeded those demanded by their predecessors, and the punishment for dilatory payments exceeded in severity the dilatory payments by a brutal magnitude of brutality, of cruelty. They needed locals to do the highly skilled jobs of hunting animals and dressing furs. The locals had the skills but were not much interested in fur, which they used mainly for their own want. Only force or commerce could turn the military teams, only force or commerce could turn them into full-time hunters, turn the locals into full-time hunters, that is. The state established the fur trade in a series of successive steps. First, the military teams confiscated the stored furs, and they kept them in fortresses that they had built by the use of building portages or rivers that connected the main Siberian rivers, the Yenisei, the Ob, and the Lena. Second, the invaders imposed a tribute for the delivery of a certain number of pelts annually, the Yasik. Third, customs posts were established for the collection of a tenth of every transaction as a fur or as a tithe. Corruption was high. Corruption was uncontrollable. Why? Bribes and other illegal fees deprived the state of substantial impetus. The major impetus for corruption was the practice of not paying Russian officials a salary. They were supposed to live by a practice known as karmlenie. Karmlenie comes from the Russian verb karmit, which means to eat, to nourish oneself, karmlenie, by which unsalaried officials were expected to feed themselves by skimming off a percentage of the taxes and dues they collected for the state. Each fort that the Russians built served as a nodal point for military domination and tribute collection, as well as to coordinate both free and compulsory settlement. The fur trade was among the first trades to go global, before silk, I should add. Though Russia was not the only source of furs, this source became increasingly important with the deforestation of Europe. Viking traders began shipping furs from Siberia to Byzantine and Persian Abbasid markets in the 10th century. The product, i.e. furs, is high value, low weight, portable, durable, and extremely well suited for long-distance conveyance in the pre-industrial age. The European fur markets began to decline from the 1560s, largely because European fashion tastes switched to silk and other fabrics coming from China. But the effects of Russian practice were gallingly ambiguous. Even as Russians had reached the Pacific by 1650, complaints reached Moscow that corruption was rampant, hunting was difficult, and animals were scarce. They were dying to extinction, the second great extinction. The conquest of Siberia was characterized by the cyclical repetition of the exhaustion of hunting grounds, the discovery of new ones, the establishment of state control in them, and so on and so forth. Ecological systems could not keep up with burgeoning consumer demand. As the market grew, population and distribution of animals shrank. Sables, the most popular furs, were overhunted by the 17th century to be replaced by sea otters, which themselves became scarce by about 1800. By then, the empire's fur tribute system was already well into the past because there were no more furs. Despite scattered instances of tribal resistance, no organized polity stood between Muscovy and the Pacific Ocean, after the collapse of the Mongol Sibir Khanate in 1577 or 1579. There are two dates offered, not that it makes much difference, talking about the 16th century. This created the largest power vacuum in the world at that time, a real power vacuum, not like Palestine, which in turn necessitated rapid development of an administrative apparatus to govern, to defend, and to exploit the region. Ironically, however, the absence of a single administrative agency for Siberia lasted during the entire Tsarist era and was not established by the Bolsheviks until the 1950s. Siberia was a destination of peasants, fleeing landowners, and government imposition. Siberia became a foil to serfdom because once they got to Siberia, they were not serfs. And its immigrants were known as the Gulyasche Lyudi, or the wandering people, in contrast to those serfs tied to the land not in Siberia. Muscovite officials acknowledged that, quote, many peasants had recently moved from Russia proper to Siberia exactly around 1649, when serfdom was formally enshrined in Russia. Serfdom did not exist in Siberia. The peasants there were state peasants. While Russian sources estimated the proportion of the fur trade to represent a quarter of the gross income of the Muscovite state, that's 1480 to 1613. One American scholar, Herbert Fisher from Stanford, gives the more credible figure of 1/10, and the Soviet scholar of the 1950s provides a figure of 1/5. You can take your pick. By 1701, revenue from fur trade brought in under 3% because there were no more furs. Close on the heels of the fur trappers came the Cossacks, who built wooden forts and exacted a fur tribute from the native tribes by taking hostages, who were usually women, children, tribal elders, and shamans, and this should be familiar to us. And now, locked inside the forts, the hostages were shown, they were not released, they were shown through a small window to their relatives when they brought their tribute in sables, minks, ermines, and foxes for inspection and extraction and confiscation. The tribute-paying tribes were also made to help the Russians in their conquest of the neighboring tribal areas by serving them as guides, by interpreters, porters, and fighters. They only got payment for this once they converted to Christianity, not before that. A duty that many tribesmen were not shy to fulfill if it meant destroying their tribal rivals. Not all the tribes are easily subdued. There was stiff resistance from the Tungus and the Buryats, to give you two examples, who were more developed in their metalworking crafts and the social organization than most other tribes. The civilian absorption of Siberia was undertaken by the influx of two waves of outsiders. The first consisted of state employees and traders bent on exploiting the fur wealth, but not necessarily permanently resident east of the Urals, that is in Siberia, rather than Europe and Russia. As the vanguard of the Russian advance, these men explored and conquered regions that formed the territorial basis of settlement in the future. The second wave, overwhelmingly was composed of our favorite characters, the peasant settler colonists, who imbued the conquest with permanence. The state obtained its furs in three distinctly different ways: as tribute or yasak from Siberian native tribes, as a tax or tithe imposed on Russian trappers and traders, and then by purchase. The vast size of Siberia was the most difficult obstacle to overcome then and now. The further east soldier settlers went, the harder it became for Moscow to control or support them. It took the best part of a year for a messenger to travel from the capital to Yakutsk, the main town in the eastern sector of Siberia, and at least another year to reach Okhotsk, which is east of the Baikal lake, which we saw a little while ago, the Russian base on the Pacific, so that an exchange of peasants could take 4 years. Exchange of messages could take 4 years. Getting food and military supplies to the advanced forces was a logistical nightmare. The Russians could not feed themselves from the tundra and mountainous forests between Yakutsk and Okhotsk, Yakutsk in eastern Siberia, Okhotsk on the Pacific. So they turned south to the Chinese Amur Valley in 1643, and here China enters our picture. Believing that the fertile fields and fish-filled rivers would feed at least 20,000 Russians every year from the 1750s onwards. Any hypothetical conquest of the Amur Valley would require a force of many thousand men, while holding the region would entail a considerable movement of peasant migrants. Neither was feasible at the time. As Russians flocked to the Amur Valley, the Chinese reduced their grain output in the vicinity as an instance of strategic deprivation, as an instance of a strategic deprivation of food as a form of resistance. The Russians were beset with a chronic problem when they arrived at the Okhotsk seaboard on the Pacific Ocean and the Kamchatka Peninsula at the Pacific littoral. What is this problem? Very simple one. How are you going to feed these guys? This was the problem of feeding the settlers and hunters in an environment that awaited the construction of forest to arable and the sowing of that arable with wheat, with rye and potatoes and cabbage, the staples of the Russian diet then and now. The buffalo, the main source of pemmican, made from dried meat or melted fat, and corn or maize, which mainly provisioned the Canadian fur trade, had no Siberian equivalent. For the first time since Moscow had started gathering the Russian lands from the Mongols through the 15th century, Russian expansion faced the problem of food supply. The problem of creating land fit for tillage was complicated by the terrain across which the Russians advanced across Siberia in the 17th century. The non-forested taiga was characterized by soil locked in permafrost, then for 8 months, now for less than a fortnight. And a short growing season, and most Siberian cities and towns are actually subsiding into the ground as we speak. And a short growing season when made fit for any cultivable purpose whatsoever. And on the one hand was the taiga, was the steppe, and then you had the coniferous taiga, where the fur bearers were to be found among impenetrable forests. They resided deep inside the forest and they couldn't get into the forest to actually contact them. Mongol and Turkic nomads, essentially the Kyrgyz tribes, prevented the future settlers from reaching the more cultivable steppe soil south of the taiga through a series of continuous military action. So therefore moving south from the inhospitable, uncultivable permafrost belt. So the Amur Valley seemed to be the best location for cereal cultivation for the food requirements of the Russian population in eastern Siberia near the Pacific Ocean. Settlement by Russians in the fertile lands of the Amur River Basin was strongly resisted by more formidable forces stationed there by the Qing state in Peking. The Russians were excluded from the Amur Valley in 1689 by the most crucial paragraph of the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which is very important, which I'll come to in about 10 minutes. Siberian officials had been instructed to seek the best lands for cultivation in 1592. Settlements by cultivators was initiated after about 1630 and involved a movement of crown, that is, peasants from lands belonging to the imperial family who were sent out on mandatory imperial orders by officials serving the emperor himself, and free peasants encouraged to move voluntarily. Of a lesser order, native Siberians, that is, the tribes, were ordered to settle in villages and pay their tribute in grain rather than in the medium of furs. So this was the problem now for them. How was this problem to be confronted? Let's move to the China end of the frontier now. What was China doing? How were they going to deal with China? The only direction in which China lacked formidable, defensible natural boundaries was in her north, where she first encountered Russia. Both the Russians and the Chinese claimed that each of their own respective borders historically constituted an integral part of their empire. The same territory they claimed to constitute an integral part of each of their own empires, the very same territory. There is ample evidence that this was not the case, could not have been the case. Russians were not even in the vicinity until the 17th century. In eastern Siberia, and they did not arrive in significant numbers before the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway began in 1891, completed in 1916. Since the Chinese did not master Western cartography, Occidental cartography, I should say, until the 20th century, earlier Chinese maps have more artistic than practical value, than cartographic value. Chinese boundary negotiations before 1880 knew virtually nothing about the lands north of the Amur and little about the Ussuri coastal region on the immediate north of the border in the Russian Empire. As for the Russians, their denial that a boundary issue existed at all, since they had allegedly taken empty lands, permitted them to delude themselves that the Chinese could not harbor any serious grievances against them. This made Russian-Chinese relations, at best, acrimonious. Russia's expansion transformed it into a Pacific power. In doing so, it posed a security threat to China. The arrival of Russia in an area that China had dominated created a new rival, more dangerous than the other European powers. For Russia alone was primarily interested not in commerce, but in the permanent acquisition of territory, unlike the Portuguese, the British, and the Americans. Qing officials were clearly aware that the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279 and the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644 were dynasties that had fallen when they could no longer defend their northern frontiers from invading barbarians. The word barbarian simply means non-Sinicized people, namely the Mongols in the case of the Song and the Manchus in the case of the Ming. In the late 19th century, China amassed troops on its northern frontier to force the Russians out of the Amur Valley, which is a contested territory, as we just noticed. The only European power with which China had any quasi-political contact, as a distinct from commercial contact, before the 19th century was Russia, which sent an embassy to Peking as early as 1567, almost 300 years before the Second Opium War. Another 10 missions followed until 1675. They all sought formal written invitation to trade, and if this was granted, the placing of that permission on a permanent foundation, black on white. Russian raids against tribute-paying people in the Baikal and the Amur regions hardened Chinese resolve against the Russians. Gradually, the Qing dynasty became alarmed by the growing Russian activities and influence in the northeast, particularly the building of forts and small settlements, even as its subjects avidly bought Siberian furs from Russians, for whom China's buyers were the first client of choice. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 was the first treaty between China and a foreign country. The Russians wanted trade with China, but the Chinese sought Russian neutrality in their conflict with neighboring Mongol tribes. Russia agreed to dismantle its frontier posts and withdraw behind the Haigun River and the watershed of the Amur rivers. Limits were placed for the first time on Russian 1689, for the first time on Russian expansion to the Pacific. The Russians exchanged territorial claims in northern Manchuria for commercial relations with the Chinese Empire. The Stanovoy Range, running as it did to the Pacific Ocean north of the Amur River, would be the border between Siberia and Manchuria till the 1930s when Stalin changed it. Nerchinsk did not open the interior of China itself to foreign trade, much less to diplomatic intercourse. It merely demarcated a boundary and it set up rules for trade interaction in the immediate frontier area, where trade relations had in fact informally existed with the barbarians for centuries. Merchants possessing valid passports from either government, Chinese or Russian, could pass freely through the lands of the other empire and trade without let or hindrance. Above all, Russia obtained peace in her Pacific maritime region. She could focus attention and resources on her western neighbors with the certainty that a defensible frontier in eastern Siberia had been secured. And I now move to the last speciality of the evening, which is Central Asia. Russia conquered Central Asia between the 1850s and the 1880s, partly to increase and protect its trade with the region. Long before the conquest of Central Asia, by the 1880s, Peter I, from 1680s to 1725, had dreamed of dominating a major international trade route between Western Europe, Central Asia, and the South Asian lands beyond. As regards the actual conquest of Central Asia, however, geopolitics was a more important spur than commerce. From the 1830s to the 1900s, Russia's major rival was Britain. Britain fought the Crimean War in 1854 to reduce Russian power. Lord Palmerston planned to roll Russia northward from the Black Sea and the Caucasus and to deprive her of most of the territory she had gained since the mid-19th century. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 that brought the Crimean War to a close denied Russia the right to protect her Black Sea coast and river mouths either by a fleet or by adequate fortifications, thereby making her vulnerable to subsequent attack by the Royal Navy. The Russian response was to move forward in Central Asia, partly as a means of regaining prestige and partly to create an equivalent threat to the frontiers of British India, immortalized in literature in a phrase that I loathe called the Great Game. In reality, at least until the 1880s, the Royal Navy was a much greater threat to Russia's Black Sea ports than the Russian army was to India. But acute British sensitivity about the Rajah's vulnerability made the supposed threat from Central Asia a useful card in Russia's hands. Russia's increased dependence on Central Asian cotton in the 1860s, the Uzbeks' Khanate's suppressive treatment of Russian merchants, and the Khanate's discriminatory tariff duties which kept most trades in the hands of local merchants were important factors in the conquest. Although Central Asian cotton had acquired a new importance to Russia on the eve of the conquest, particularly when American supplies of long-grained white cotton were cut off temporarily for 4 years by the American Civil War, and considerable social sentiment existed for an advance into Central Asia to protect and promote Russian manufacturing and trading interests, the influence of all these factors on policy formation was minimal. Russia was spurred on in Central Asia by a compound of motives, other motives. The quest for a secure frontier, the provocations offered by unstable neighbors, the fear of being excluded from the area by England, and the temptations of diplomatic leverage, economic profit, and military glory. The conquest of Central Asia was not military planned, but it was the only systematic addition to the Russian Empire by almost exclusively military means, but not centrally planned. But it was the result of initiatives by local military commanders made possible by conflicting bureaucratic interests in St. Petersburg. Initially, the Russian forces had to deal only with the opposition of the nomads and the Khanate forces in the Great Uzbek Desert. But the advance in the direction of India and the Chinese frontier transformed the regional character of the struggle over the Trans-Caspian and Indo-Asian borderlands. It became the fulcrum of the rivalry with Britain, touching over a long period of tension over delimiting imperial frontiers and signaling the opening gambit of Russian penetration into Chinese territory. In 1881, 14 years after the establishment of the Turkestan Krai, which is the name of the Turkestan administrative province in 1867, Russian customs posts were installed along the Russian borders of Bukhara and Khiva. Bukhara and Khivan goods were admitted duty-free into Russia, but the import of goods originating in other countries, primarily from India and England, was prohibited except for green tea, for indigo, for opium and muslin, Malwa opium mainly, on which a high tariff was placed. By 1891, the Deputy Commissioner of Peshawar reported that Russian prohibitions and customs duties could be considered redundant since the transit trade to Afghanistan with Central Asia may be said to have ceased. Trade in the northwestern sector was limited to meeting Afghan consumer needs only. The hesitations and turnabouts of the Russian government over the question of organizing Central Asia critically stemmed from a profound ignorance of the region. It was not until the decade after 1873 that geographic knowledge about these protectorates, the Uzbek Khanates, was increased by means of organized scientific expeditions, military reconnaissance of possible routes for the Russian army, and studies by the geographers and ethnographers who often accompanied Russian embassies and military expeditions. It was not merely, Central Asia, the Uzbek Khanates were not merely the most territorially fluctuating region of the empire in administrative terms. Central Asia was also one of the most isolated regions of the empire. The scientific mapping of Bukhara and Khiva, begun in the early 1880s, was continued until by 1914 both Khanates had been completely mapped. By then the World War had broken out. Over the last half century of imperial rule, Turkestan could claim the title of Russia's real or only colony. It was distant, so it was isolated geographically by deserts until the construction of railways linking it to Europe. It was so distant that it might as well have been an overseas colony. The Russian Civil War, which is usually dated from 1918 to 1921, was waged most protractedly in this part of the empire, where it erupted in 1916 over the forcible conscription of Central Asian peoples into the imperial army, which was rejected because it also entailed forcible conversions. So it erupted in 1916 before the revolution and was finally quelled as late as 1926. The World War destroyed the Russian Empire not because the army was defeated, but because the home front collapsed. Before the revolution in 1917, Russia's military record was actually no worse than that of its Western allies. if the Russian army was on the whole inferior to the German army, the same was usually true of the French and British armies. In 1916, Russia's economic and military performance was often spectacular in terms of what came before and what came after, in highly relative terms. The Brusilov offensive in summer 1916 inflicted major defeats on the Austrians and the Germans and took German pressure off the Allies at Verdun, which is very critical to Allied victory on the Western Front. The Somme and the Italian battles on the Isonzo front. Meanwhile, against the Ottomans, the Russians had done far better than the British, who had been defeated at Gallipoli and in Mesopotamia in 1915, which caused Churchill's justifiable expulsion from the cabinet. By contrast, the Russian army had defeated the Ottomans in every engagement and were driving deep into Anatolia in northern Turkey, which you will probably remember as one of the areas on which the second genocide was conducted against the Armenians. Into Anatolia when revolution came. The revolution came partly because of wartime economic sufferings on the home front, but of all because of a complete collapse of faith in the Tsarist regime among most Russian elites and the Russian urban masses. Transcaucasia, Turkestan, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Finland proclaimed independence from the Bolshevik Republic. In December of 1917, Latvia followed in January, and Estonia in February 1918. Russia had ceased to exist. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Arup, for this really fascinating, wide-ranging lecture, which addresses really the kind of technologies of expansion, drawing on administration, military power, and what's also very interesting is the deployment of populations, especially the peasantry, and Christianity. It's a very wide-ranging, and it's fascinating because it kind of ranges from the military to the environment and so many kinds of issues that you've taken up. I don't know if you have time for questions. Taupati may...
Unless, we do have to wind up. But if somebody wants to come in, there is a microphone.
I'll just start the ball rolling if it's okay with you.
Fine by me, fine.
Yeah. Actually, some of your thing also made sense, in a sense, about Nikitin's sense of selfhood, which was very wrapped up in Christianity.
In the 1670s.
That's in the 16th or 15th century, 15th to 16th. Anyway. So I was just wondering, there was another aspect of Nikitin's sense of selfhood, which was this kind of sense of loss of the country, of his identification of the country. And was there a kind of idea, nascent idea of quote-unquote patriotism and so on and so forth, that also operated ideologically in terms of consolidating the empire, or at least consolidating the core of the empire around this? So that was one question. And the
Let
other...
me answer this one first.
Yeah, please.
Hari, like many other things that he did, has retrieved the different registers in which Afanasi Nikitin registered his grief by leaving his home province of Tver, which happened to be the area that Hari researched for his PhD. Nikitin was a very devout Orthodox Christian. Tver was a very famous center for certain very beautiful churches and was a center for icon making, Andrei Rublev and making of icons, which Chiru would be familiar with. Okay, so he was quite desolate, but he had to leave for political reasons because he was being persecuted, but not prosecuted. He left. And this feeling of desolation and grief followed him through India. And even when he was in Hampi, when he was in the Bahmani kingdom, and he went to Vijayanagar and all that, and he recorded this, and he really missed his Russian homeland. He missed his Russian homeland from his heart, and he missed his Russian homeland from his brain, because his comments on India, south of India's, was a little bit like Catherine Mayo's book, Mother India, where he spoke about the dirt and the primitive customs, and you get the gist. Yeah, so Afanasi Nikitin did feel dispossessed, intellectually and emotionally. What's the next question?
No, I was actually wondering about this other register about his feeling for the nation, for the country, and so on. I mean, the Christian part of it is understandable, especially from what you... But he does seem to kind of think, at least from what I gathered from this thing, but maybe that was just a subsidiary kind of register.
There were rather few people, as the historical records seem to suggest, which would bring down to us a sentiment of belonging to a political formation expressed by the person expressing it in sympathetic terms. Because the empire itself was so amorphous, because it was so despotic, because it was so distant, and so it was unrelatable.
Right. So, yeah, I'll hold on to my question, but if anybody else has a question, please.
To ask one thing is, how come did you manage to do this?
I think I can bring this up to you.
This tapestry, this vast empirical tapestry in 2 hours almost without a sip of water. You had no sip of water. How did you manage that?
I'll have to think about it.
Vast tapestry, I mean, vast area.
You know, he's coming out of a long thing, so I think he would have spoken for another hour.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
I think Ashok.
Yeah, there's a question here.
I can hear you actually.
Hello, yeah.
I can hear
no,
you.
Mike, my question is very rudimentary and is more, I'm curious. You talked about a lot of migration that took place in the entire space, whether forced or voluntary. It contributed to different kind of...
It was both.
It was both. How was migration at that time viewed? Because we talk about migration in today's context in different ways. I'm just curious to know, in that space, in that time, how was migration viewed by the people as well as authorities? I don't know whether...
Maybe we just collect a few questions.
Sure.
Yeah. Come. But
Okay. Arup, fascinating, but I just catch on to Ashok's question. I think what you said about waves of migration, but the bulk of the migration, Russian migration, is in the 19th century. And bulk of it, the massive bulk, 50 million that is, we know from the 50 million, it is as big as the European migration, transatlantic migration, 1840 to 90. This is the size, 50 million. Now, if it is so, and it's now being proved that it is very much linked to world capitalist cycles, business cycles beginning from 1840.
Right, yeah.
Now, from the way you stretched it out over a long period, it would seem you yourself stretched that the enshrinement of serfdom is actually linked to the migration itself.
Very much so.
Very much so. Huh? So it's all well known, Domar's model of that. So I was wondering this 19th century thing, 19th century, the bulk of this migration which happened. First, it is a capitalist induced migration. It's not a result of long-standing feudal form. So you have given much more stronger impulse to the geopolitics as being far more important in shaping this frontier. How would you really place the peculiarly capitalist structure of the 19th century Russia? Because, there's a whole big debate about it. But would you say that this, at least 50 million people moving to this, is itself a sign not only of peasant expansion or the state expansion, it is of a deeply capitalist nature of migration, comparable, in fact, to the European migration, to transatlantic migration, which actually began the process of capitalist America in some sense. So I was just wondering, how do you place this migration?
Just take these two because they're on the same subject.
Sure.
I'm sorry, pardon me for not catching your name.
Ashok.
Ashok Bhattacharya. Okay, look, migration was state organized to a certain extent, but migration was essentially driven by the lack of alternatives in the north. Okay, and migration was state directed because the state itself had to find suitable cultivable land for their serfs. Migration was essentially to provide servitors moving south with the serfs to be able to cultivate their land and to be able to therefore raise. Russia never had a standing army until the Crimean War. The army was raised locally by servitors. Okay, so for the servitors to be able to maintain the peasants, and they were not paid either. So they maintained their military forces through the lifespan of serfdom by the proceeds of the land that they had been given as estate. So serfdom was driven in a dual fashion by the state and also by the, I hesitate to use this word and you'll excuse me for my using it conditionally, which is a spontaneous process, by the peasants themselves. Why do I hesitate to use this? Because attributing spontaneity to the peasantry is an intellectual exercise which is hard to actually register at that time. So it occurred in both ways. I don't know whether that answers the question or not, but
I was also interested in knowing whether there was any, was there any economic incentive and whether the economic disincentive. These days, modern day migration is looked at as a sign of progress. If there is more migration, it is seen that a sign of aspiration. Is less migration is a sign of. So, I was just trying to visualize that world and how was migration seen really.
I'm going to answer your question by partly answering Prabhu's, which will become evident in 3 seconds. There was a very, very important economic calculus, and is known today by the word existential. What was basically happening was that the soil had refused to. These were areas of shifting cultivation. These were areas of barely 2 harvests a year were possible. These were areas in the north where the growing season was 6 weeks, further south and in the furthest north part of Muscovy, the growing season was about 3 weeks. There was no place to keep the animals during winter, to bring out to the fields. These were areas where you created furrows by cattle and so on. So it was existential because they had to get to areas that were warmer, they had to get to areas that were productive. They had to get to areas that were arable because they were tillable. That's essentially it. Prabhu, as a very old friend, let's agree to disagree about something. Which is that Alexander Gerschenkron, one of the founders of Russian studies at the University of Harvard, established a famous ratio between the increase of population and the decrease in the availability of land for rent or purchase after the emancipation of serfdom. That's the nub of what known as the agrarian question in Russia, the agrarny вопрос. People, land, what can they do? Basically what happened is land hunger. Population increased by 80%, land availability increased by 50%. Then this progressively, and Gerschenkron begins this calculation in the famous Cambridge Economic History of the Order Particle, Volume 6, in around the middle of the 19th century, which is when you're talking about. What we agree to disagree about as friends is this 50 million figure. No, so therefore not capitalist. Very little of Russian agriculture was capitalist, A. B, very little of substantial part of Russian agriculture was drawn into capitalist circuits of trade. Most of that grain was going out from the Black Sea ports of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian grain being cultivated by people like Trotsky's grandfather, people like that, on the Ukrainian steppe. Okay, this was being shipped out to the Black Sea ports. So therefore, it was Ukrainian grain, both black grain and white grain, wheat and rye, as well as sugar beet. Sugar beet is very, very important, and sugar beet cultivation in the hands of Polish Catholic landlords. So this was going out of Poland. Now, when you had the long European depression, as you know, from the 1860s to the 1880s, during that time, there was a severe shortage of grain in Europe because not coming through from Chicago, and across the Atlantic. So a lot of the grain that Europe got in those closing decades of the 19th century, which is your area of question, came from Ukraine. Okay, so this is how international export circuits were drawn into a capitalist mode of international exchange, but domestically Russian agriculture was almost untouched by capitalism. Why do I say this? I'll give you just one figure. The failure of the Stolypin reforms. The Stolypin reforms wanted to convert scattered peasant holdings into compact plots, either Khutori or Utrebi. It didn't work. They wanted to get rid of the commune because the commune was a backward institution which perpetuated cultivation strips and things like that. It didn't work. And after the revolution, the first thing that the peasants did was that the land that had gone into the communes, that had come away from the communes by the wealthy peasants, known unfortunately as kulak, which simply means a fist, right? They bought that land back. So there were pockets of cultivation, and even the development of capitalism, which he wrote in prison without any literature, like Brodel's book in a German prison, like that. There was very little capitalism in the Russian countryside.
I think I don't disagree with that.
Did I misread your question?
We'll take some more questions.
Yes, sure. Just merely saying that it was not about the characterization of Russian agriculture. It was the characterization of the massive movement of population. How would you?
I'm sure. I'm sure that the figure of 50% is right, because I think most of what you say is right. But I haven't come 50 million, because I haven't come across it. So I mean, thanks for. But look, I mean, basically the main spur to immigration increased in geometrical progression rather than arithmetical progression with the building of the Transsib. Okay, from 1880 onwards. That is when, and then you had all sorts of other, reveries that were given to the peasants when they moved into Siberia. Which I mentioned earlier on.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Radhika, please.
I'm not sure there's time for it, but throughout the lecture, which was, mind-blowing in its sweep and scope, we kept getting these intriguing references to how Putin is referencing this history, and we wanted to know a little bit about it.
I think there are three important reasons.
Navalny dies in a Siberian prison. Nothing's changed.
I'm going to answer this question in 6 minutes, even though Radhika is in 1 minute. I'm going to answer this question in 1 minute, simply because Radhika is a fellow laborer in this particular area of study. There are three important reasons why Ukraine has been important to Russia historically. One is that it's been the gates of Europe, which is brought out most dramatically by a book by Serhiy Plokhy, who heads the Ukrainian Studies Center at Harvard University. He calls Ukraine has been the gates of Europe since the 1670s, when Bohdan Khmelnytsky established a very short-lived Ukrainian empire, carved out of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the gates of Europe, because the invaders came into Russia through the Ukraine, and it went out, and they left Russia. That's one. I'm coming to an end very soon. Second important reason, which I think we got a sense of in the last hour or so, is grain. Ukrainian grain was critical to the Russian Empire. The third, Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rih was the main Ukrainian mining site for coal. It was then known as Kryvyi Rog in Russian. Donetsk and Luhansk were the main centers of Russian imperial metallurgical industry founded by Yuzovs, by somebody called Hughes. The Nobel Prize comes from the use of dynamite in clearing land for mining in Ukraine. So the metallurgical foundries of Ukraine and the grain of Ukraine provided the sinews for administration as well as warfare. Third, it was cultural. From the 18th century, if not earlier, Russia did not have an identity or a sense of self without Ukraine. That is why by the way, in 1914, the Russian commander of the armies said that without Ukraine, we do not have a Russia. In 1941, Stalin said that we have to get back Ukraine because the first areas where the German armies went into Russia was in Ukraine, in the south, and that is where they were offered grain and bread as the traditional forms of hospitality. Then you had Alexander Dugin, who said the same thing and fed whatever mind Putin has. And his daughter was the one who was killed in that sabotage car bombing outside Moscow about a year ago. You probably know about that. Now, the Ukrainian identity was based on a language, was based on a literature, was based on a cultural diversity, was based on a multi-confessional nature. The Ukrainian language and literature began to be prohibited from the 1670s. In 1673, you had a decree passed by the Russian ruler, 1873, okay? And curbs on the Ukrainian language as the medium of instruction and as a medium of creative expression began to come into force from the 1850s onwards. In 1863, according to terms of the Valuyev Circular, who was the number 2 in the Russian Ministry of Education under somebody called Poskrebyshev, they put a complete ban on anything published in the Ukrainian language, either in fiction or not in fiction. Okay, complete ban. The most famous Ukrainian poet, Taras Shevchenko, okay, wrote in Ukrainian, went to Moscow and was formally driven out of there because he insisted on writing in Ukrainian. Why not? He is Ukrainian. All right? And so he got a job in Kiev. The most famous Ukrainian historian of nationalism in Ukraine was Mikhail Hrushevsky, spelled with an H. And he was the one who first defined, he did for Ukrainian nationalism what people like Gokhale and Tilak and Nauroji did in India. In other words, identify and single out the salient strands of a future Ukrainian. It is true that for Russians, you do not have an empire without Ukraine. You do not have a Eurasian empire without Ukraine. It's impossible. It is impossible. And people have known this before Trump. Because of these reasons that I have just spelled out. I obviously by no means, suggesting anything else than what I've just said. So,
I think we'll...
I don't know where I was transported, whether to my JNU classes or discussion, but the sheer joy of your joy of history, the passion, I mean, it just brought alive so many other past experiences of relating to this. And if you are staying at home and doing all this, it's really hats off. It was just amazing.
Thanks
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
very much. I mean, scholarship can be passionate, and that's something that really came through. And I don't believe in afterlife, but if there is one, I think I can picture Hari with a gleam in his joy in his eyes and face after hearing this lecture.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Arup.
My pleasure. Entirely my pleasure.
This was truly magisterial in terms of what you covered, in terms of the passion, and the time you held us together. I think you should do it more often, Arup. You need to come out of your hibernation and talk to us more and more. I think Hari would have been thrilled that I achieved what I think he was never able to persuade. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, PK, for overseeing this. And thank you, everybody, for staying back. It's been 2.5 hours since we began, so thank you very much for being with us. We hope in some form or the other to keep this annual event going, whether Mrinalini said no more boring history. She wants now Bollywood and the Bolsheviks. She's decided on the next theme. She's identified a scholar who's worked on this, so now it'll be over. I'm also thinking of involving Ishan Sharma of the Karwan Heritage Lecture Series, who was very keen that they should take on a named lecture in an area of connected but broadly non-Indian history. So we'll see where we'll go. But it's a promise to keep this thing going, because it's an occasion for all of us to get together, to listen to some very good talks, and of course to remember Hari. So thank you very much, PK, and thank you, Arup. Can't thank you enough, really.
Just one sentence.
Yeah.
You know that one could have done no less for Hari.
Huh?
You know that one could have done no less for Hari.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.